For those of you that were gone yesterday, we covered everything. We were on a roll. We covered everything except for final actions by President Adams. And that's what we're going to cover today. And then I'm going to give you a little time to study. And then we're going to have a group quiz, just like we did second period. We're going to ask everybody a question. If you get it right, the group gets 1 point. If you get it wrong, then we don't get a point. We all get the same score. Yes?
On second period,
They had 20 out of 20. That's because they had tremendous instruction, so don't let me down here, okay? Don't let me down. So, all right, here's who we're starting with when we talk about final actions by President Adams. Before we talk about that, we kind of have to explain where we're at. So, Thomas Jefferson has been elected President of the United States by virtue of the House of Representatives, right? But he doesn't take office the day he's elected, does he? No, there's a period of time in today's world, it's about 3 months from November, December, January, about 2 months. What's the elections like, November 8th or something like that? And then the third week in January is when the new president takes office. So that period of time from the time the election happened to the time the new president takes over the office, for the sitting president is kind of what we call a lame duck period. And what we mean by that is, I'll give you the best example. So when I decided not to be the principal anymore, quite a few years ago, and Mr. Smith was named the principal, during the time from January 1st until the end of the school year, I knew I wasn't coming back, and I knew he was going to be the principal. So that was kind of a lame duck period of time for me as principal. You still got to do your job, but you don't want to make any decisions or do anything that the next person's going to have to live with. So when I was serving the rest of my term as principal, I didn't put in new policies on cell phones and new policies on dress code and all this stuff that Mr. Smith would have to live with when he was principal. Okay, so I just kind of had a lame duck period where I kept the lid on it, did my job, but I didn't do anything progressive. If Mr. Smith, and I know he was at the time, during the time he served as assistant principal, probably the last couple of months, he was preparing for the principalship, putting together a handbook and doing some things that expressed his philosophies. Now, he and I had a lot of the same philosophies, so things didn't change much. But John Adams, who's a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, who's a Republican, are going to have much different philosophies. So it would be nice for Jefferson if Adams kind of just plays out the 4 months, because at this time in history there was 4 months from the period of the election day to the day that Jefferson would be inaugurated. And it would have been nice for Jefferson if Adams would have just kind of taken it easy, right? Well, he didn't. He did two things of significance that was going to affect Thomas Jefferson when he became president. So I'm going to tell you what those two things he did was. One was actually good and one wasn't so good. But both were done, frankly, by Adams and the Federalist-controlled Congress to kind of aggravate Jefferson and try to strengthen the Federalist Party before Jefferson took over the presidency. Now, the first thing that we're going to talk about is what Adams did is he appointed a new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Adams appointed a new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, don't you think that Jefferson would have rather that Adams waited that 4 months and let him pick the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? Because that's who he was going to be working with, so to speak, right? Well, he didn't do that. He picked a guy by the name of John Marshall. John Marshall. And he would replace who? Who was the first Chief Justice of the United States? John Jay. So John Marshall is going to replace John Jay. And guess what party John Marshall's a party of? If the president's a Federalist, you can imagine that he appointed a Federalist judge. Okay? Well, that probably wasn't in Thomas Jefferson's best interest at the time of the appointment. Now, it's just like President Trump appointed this Kavanaugh, Judge Kavanaugh. Look at all the heck that guy went through trying to get, approved by Congress. Why didn't Marshall have much trouble being approved by Congress? Because they were controlled by the Federalists, okay? Now, when we talk about this, this was one of the two things that Adams did that was probably a good thing. Although he and Jefferson didn't agree on everything. And by the way, did you know that John Marshall was cousin of President-elect Jefferson. They were cousins, which is even kind of more ironic. But John Marshall served on the Supreme Court for 34 years, from 1801 to 1835. He was a very effective Supreme Court justice, and if you talk to historians, would tell you probably is in the top 5 of Supreme Court justices that we've had in this country's history. Very good pick, was an excellent Supreme Court justice, served for 34 years on the Supreme Court from 1801 to 1835, and he was involved in more than 500 Supreme Court decisions. So a lot of the way this country works is because of decisions that was made during the John Marshall-led Supreme Court. So that's one thing Adams did. He replaced Chief Justices of the Supreme Court from John Jay to John Marshall. Marshall served 34 years as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and was involved in over 500 decisions. And he was a very good Supreme Court justice. That doesn't mean he and Jefferson agreed all the time, but as history looks at it, that was a good choice. I'm sure Thomas Jefferson didn't appreciate it when it happened at the time. Okay? Now, the second thing that was done not so much by Adams, but it was done by the Federalist-controlled Congress. And they passed a new law called the Judiciary Act of 1801. The Judiciary Act of 1801. That sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? Because we did have the Judiciary Act of 1789. And what did that do, Aisha? Do you remember what the Judiciary Act of 1789 did?
Didn't it make a court system?
It established the court system in the United States. Remember, we had 13 district courts, 1 in each state, 3 circuit courts, right, and 1 Supreme Court. Well, what the Judiciary Act of 1801 did, it would increase the number of these judges by 16 more. There would be 16 more judges now become a part of this federal court system that was established by the Judiciary Act of 1789. So just 11 years later, or 12 years later, now they're going to add 16 more judges. Why would that be a concern for Thomas Jefferson? What? Well, that didn't bother me so much, but think about it. Why is Thomas Jefferson not going to be thrilled about the Judiciary Act of 1801? Is he against 16 new judges necessarily? But what are they going to be? Federalists, because who picks them? The President of the United States. So basically what happened here when the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, it increased the number of judges in the federal court system by an additional 16. All 16 are going to be picked by the President of the United States, who is a Federalist. Is that going to thrill Thomas Jefferson? Absolutely not. But can you see what they're doing here? They're trying to give more power to the Federalist Party before Adams leaves office, right? Probably not the kosher thing to do. Now, most of these 16 appointments of new judges were made by President Adams the night before Jefferson would be inaugurated. Okay? And some of them he even waited till midnight, just before midnight, to choose. Because once it got past midnight, could he do that? No, because he's no longer the president after midnight. Now, because these appointments, most of these 16 appointments were made at the last minute, just before midnight, they're known in history as the midnight appointments. Midnight appointments. So those are things that President Adams did during the 4 months of what we call his lame duck presidency. He should have probably sat still, according to Republicans, but instead he took big action that's going to affect Thomas Jefferson. Now Jefferson's not going to like this, and when we get into Jefferson's political future and presidency, you'll figure this out. What we're moving into next will be the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition. We're going to do that first and then come back and talk about politics during the Jefferson presidency, and you'll see what he tries to do about these federal judges that have been appointed. Being appointed and being confirmed are two different things, and he's going to try to put the kibosh on these 16 ever been able to take office when he gets to be president, but that's the way he's done it all. Okay, any questions at all on that? Okay, I'm going to give you about 11 minutes to study your notes, study together, and then we absolutely are going to take a group quiz on this. We're 20 points. So get your stuff together. And every single person is going to be asked a question, and we'll go from there.